In 2021, the justices of the United States Supreme Court dismissed a case brought by former child slaves from Mali. The plaintiffs had accused Nestle and Cargill of knowingly aiding and profiting from their enslavement on Ivorian cocoa farms. The court ruled that the abuses had occurred on foreign soil, outside the reach of American law. The corporate defendants faced no liability. No remedy was awarded to the former slaves. While the justices deliberated inside a marble courthouse in Washington, the fields of West Africa continued to produce nearly two-thirds of the planet's chocolate supply. By the most conservative estimates, over 2 million children were engaged in hazardous work on the cocoa farms of Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana during the decade that case crawled through the courts. That is the number published by Tulane University in its 2015 survey commissioned by the United States Department of Labor. Those children wielded machetes to split open seed pods the size of footballs. They hauled sacks of wet beans heavier than their own bodies. They applied pesticides without protective equipment. They worked on farms that fed a global industry worth more than $130 billion every year. Yet in a grocery store in Paris, in a vending machine in Tokyo, in a kitchen cupboard in suburban Ohio, chocolate sat on the shelf wrapped in bright foil. It was a harmless treat. A small pleasure at the end of a long day, cheap enough to toss into a shopping cart without a second thought. The distance between those two realities spanned thousands of miles and several centuries of careful forgetting. The true history of cacao was far stranger and far darker than anyone picking up a candy bar would ever expect. It did not begin in a factory or a plantation. It began roughly 3,500 years ago in the humid rainforests of the Amazon basin, before spreading north into the first great civilizations of Mesoamerica. The wild cacao tree grew in the shaded understory, its oblong pods sprouting directly from the trunk like strange ridged tumors. Inside each pod, a pale, sweet pulp encased rows of bitter purple seeds that looked nothing like food. The people who first cracked those pods open discovered something that would alter the trajectory of human culture, religion, and eventually, global commerce. The earliest physical proof of this discovery did not come from a temple or a tomb. It came from the shattered remains of pottery, found at a site called Puerto Escondido in the Ulua Valley of modern-day Honduras. In the early 2000s, archaeologists analyzing ceramic vessels from the site scraped residue from the inner walls of jars and spouted pitchers dating to roughly 1500 BC. They ran the samples through a process that detects theobromine, an alkaloid compound unique to the cacao tree. The tests came back positive. Those vessels had once held a liquid made from fermented, ground cacao pulp and seeds. The people who used them were the Olmec, the mother culture of Mesoamerica, the civilization that carved colossal stone heads from single boulders and built the earliest complex urban centers in the region. The Olmec left no written language, no glyphs, no codices, no carved stela recounting their myths or their kings. Everything known about them is reconstructed from scattered artifacts, buried foundations, and fragments of pottery. But the theobromine in those jars told a specific story. It meant the Olmec were fermenting cacao seeds, separating them from the sweet white pulp that surrounded them, drying them, roasting them, grinding them, and mixing the resulting paste with water to produce a drink. The word they used for that drink is lost. The rituals they built around it are invisible in the archaeological record. What survives is the residue, and from that residue, scientists could trace a direct lineage to every subsequent cacao culture in the Americas. When the Olmec civilization faded around 400 BC, their agricultural knowledge did not vanish. It passed to their successor cultures, including the one that would elevate cacao to a substance of cosmic importance. The Maya adopted the cacao tree and gave it a name that still echoes today. The classic Maya word was cacao. It appears carved into the surface of a ceramic vessel discovered at the archaeological site of Rio Azul in northern Guatemala. That vessel dates to approximately 460 AD. The glyphs on its surface do not obscure their meaning. They identify the contents of the pot with phonetic precision. The Maya made no secret of what they valued most. For the Maya, cacao beans were money. They were counted, traded, stored, and used to purchase goods and labor across a network of city-states stretching from the Yucatan Peninsula to the highlands of Guatemala and into parts of Honduras and El Salvador. A rabbit could be purchased for a handful of beans. A woven cloak cost more. The beans were portable, durable, and difficult to counterfeit because their bitter taste and purple-brown color were instantly recognizable. Beyond their economic function, cacao beans were a portal to the sacred. Maya elites consumed a frothy, bitter drink made from ground cacao paste, water, and spices during coronation ceremonies, marriage negotiations, funerary rites, and diplomatic feasts between rival kings. The drink was not merely a beverage, it was a performance. Servants poured it from one vessel into another from a height, repeating the motion until a thick layer of reddish-brown foam rose to the surface. That foam was the most prized part of the drink, believed to contain the essence of the cacao's spiritual power. The Madrid Codex, one of the few surviving Maya bark paper books, contains pages of painted scenes depicting gods bleeding onto cacao pods. In one panel, a deity sits cross-legged, piercing his own ear with a sharpened bone awl. Streams of blood cascade downward and land directly on open cacao pods arranged below him. The image was not symbolic in the way modern viewers might assume. The Maya believed that the cacao tree was a living bridge between the underworld, the earthly realm, and the sky. The tree's natural habitat was the dark, humid forest floor, a place the Maya associated with Xibalba, the subterranean realm of spirits and ancestors. The pods grew from the trunk low to the ground, close to the soil of the dead. But the fruit that emerged climbed upward toward the canopy and the sun. The blood offering completed the circuit. Human sacrifice nourished the tree that sustained the gods, who sustained the human world. The drink itself was prepared with ingredients that amplified its physical intensity. Dried chili peppers added a sharp, lingering heat. Vanilla, harvested from wild orchids that grew in the same forests, lent an aromatic depth. Annatto seeds, crushed to release a vivid red pigment, tinted the liquid the color of dried blood. The mixture was poured cold, never heated. It was unsweetened. The first time a European tongue touched it, centuries later, the reaction would border on revulsion. But to the Maya, that bitterness was the taste of power, of connection to forces invisible and immense. The farmers who grew the cacao knew the tree was delicate. It required deep shade, constant humidity, and soil rich in decaying leaf litter. It could not tolerate standing water or direct scorching sun. Plantations were carved carefully into the jungle, often on raised terraces or in the moist hollows of limestone sinkholes called cenotes. The trees took years to fruit. Their flowers, tiny pink-white stars that sprouted directly from the bark of the trunk and lower branches, bloomed by the thousands. Only a small fraction of those flowers were ever pollinated by small flies called midges that lived in the humid leaf litter below the canopy. Each successfully pollinated flower produced a single pod, a ridged, leathery capsule that ripened from green to yellow or deep red over 5 to 6 months. Inside, the seeds were packed in 5 neat rows, surrounded by the pale, mucilaginous pulp that tasted faintly of lychee and citrus. The seeds themselves, stripped of that pulp and dried on woven mats under the sun, turned a deep mahogany brown. Their taste was astringent, earthy, and profoundly bitter. But when fermented, roasted on clay comales over charcoal fires, and ground on stone metates with a heavy stone mano, the bitterness transformed. The natural fats within the seeds broke down and released an aroma that was floral, nutty, and almost intoxicating. The resulting paste could be formed into cakes and dried, then shaved into water when the drink was needed. These cakes were traded, stored as wealth, and carried on long journeys as both sustenance and currency. The Maya system of cacao cultivation and consumption did not change in a single generation. It deepened and elaborated over centuries, passing to the Toltecs and then to the people who built the largest empire Mesoamerica had ever seen. By the time the Aztec Empire consolidated its grip on central Mexico in the early 1400s, the cacao tree had been under human cultivation for nearly 3 millennia. And the Aztecs inherited everything the Maya and the Toltecs had learned about it. They just built something far larger. The Nahuatl word for the bean was cacahuatl. It appears repeatedly in the tribute lists painted onto sheets of bark paper by Aztec scribes. The most famous of those lists, compiled around 1541, is the Codex Mendoza. It was commissioned by Spanish authorities in New Spain to document the workings of the empire they had just conquered. Page after page of pictographs records exactly what each conquered province owed to the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan every single year. The entries are specific. Thousands of jaguar pelts, hundreds of jade beads, bushels of dried chili peppers, and cacao beans, counted in loads of 24,000 at a time. The Codex lists entire provinces whose primary tribute obligation was cacao. Part of the reason was geographic. The Aztec capital sat on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, ringed by mountains and high-altitude plains where frost could kill a cacao sapling overnight. The tree simply refused to grow there. So cacao had to flow inward from the humid lowlands of the Soconusco region along the Pacific coast, and from the Gulf Coast province of Xoconochco. The Aztecs conquered those zones specifically for their cacao output. The tribute requirements were not negotiable. Provincial governors who failed to deliver the demanded quantity of beans faced severe consequences, sometimes military retaliation. The beans arrived in Tenochtitlan on the backs of porters who walked in long caravans along stone-paved causeways that connected the island city to the mainland. Each porter carried a woven basket containing roughly 24,000 beans. The baskets were emptied into imperial storehouses guarded by palace officials. From there, the beans entered the bloodstream of the Aztec economy. The exchange rates were formalized and widely understood. A turkey could be purchased for 100 cacao beans. A woven cotton cloak, one of the most valuable trade goods in the empire, cost between 65 and 100 beans, depending on its length and the tightness of its weave. A single avocado was worth 3 beans, a rabbit 10 beans, and a human being could be purchased for around 1,000 cacao beans. This was not an informal barter gesture. The Codex Mendoza depicts markets in Tenochtitlan's sister city of Tlatelolco, where thousands of buyers and sellers transacted daily, using cacao as the medium of exchange. Judges patrolled the market to punish counterfeiters who tried to pass off hollowed-out beans stuffed with mud or sawdust. The counterfeiters were caught, tried, and executed publicly. The bean was money in the most literal sense. It was also the emperor's personal drink. Moctezuma II, the Aztec ruler who would face Hernán Cortés in 1519, consumed cacao on a scale that stunned the Spanish men who witnessed it. The conquistador Bernal Díaz del Castillo wrote his account decades later, old and living on a modest estate in Guatemala, but he never forgot what he saw in Moctezuma's palace. He described a ritual of precise, almost theatrical repetition. Servants brought the emperor a golden cup filled with a dark, frothy liquid. The cup was presented with both hands and a lowered gaze. Moctezuma drank it in silence, seated before a painted screen depicting his ancestors. The drink was called chocolatl. The word comes from xococ, meaning sour or bitter, and atl, meaning water. It was prepared by grinding roasted cacao beans on a stone matat with a heavy stone mano until the paste gleamed with its own released oils. The paste was mixed with cold water, never heated. Dried chili peppers were ground and added for a sharp, lingering burn that hit the back of the throat. Vanilla, harvested from wild climbing orchids that grew in the humid forests of Veracruz, lent a deep floral note. Annatto seeds, crushed to release their vivid red pigment, tinted the liquid the color of dried blood. Sometimes wild honey was stirred in, though sugar did not exist in the pre-Columbian Americas. The mixture was poured back and forth between two vessels from a height until a thick layer of reddish-brown foam rose to the surface. Díaz del Castillo wrote that the emperor consumed the drink before visiting his wives. He did not speculate on why. The Aztecs themselves had no doubt about what the drink did. Bernardino de Sahagún, the Franciscan friar who spent his life compiling the most exhaustive ethnographic record of Aztec civilization ever produced, documented cacao with the precision of a man who understood he was preserving a vanishing world. His Historia General de las Cosas de Nueva España, assembled over decades with the help of indigenous informants who had lived in the Aztec Empire before the conquest, dedicates entire sections to cacao. Sahagún cataloged the different varieties of the bean recognized by Aztec merchants. He recorded the recipes used by palace chefs. He noted that the drink was reserved for rulers, noble warriors, and wealthy long-distance traders called pachteca. Commoners who consumed it without permission were punished. He also recorded a warning from his indigenous informants. Cacao, they told him, could make a person drunk if consumed in excess. It was not the same as the intoxication produced by fermented agave sap, but something subtler and more dangerous. A person who drank too much chocolatl would become restless, overexcited, unable to sleep, prone to erratic speech and impulsive decisions. The Aztecs treated this as a real physiological effect, not a metaphor. Sahagún wrote it down without editorial comment. The drink was pharmacologically active, and the Aztecs had known it for centuries. The Spanish would learn it soon enough. But by the time Sahagún and Díaz del Castillo were writing their accounts, the world they described had already been shattered. A Maya trading canoe intercepted by a Genoese sailor in 1502 had set in motion a chain of events that would pull cacao across an ocean and into the mouths of kings, merchants, and eventually every corner of the planet. The canoe appeared off the coast of what is now Honduras in the summer of 1502. It was a Maya trading vessel, carved from a single massive tree trunk and covered by a palm frond canopy. Beneath the canopy sat roughly 24 men and women, along with a cargo that included woven cotton textiles, copper bells, obsidian blades, and ceramic vessels. Christopher Columbus was on his fourth and final voyage to the Americas. He was 51 years old, sick with gout, and increasingly unpopular with the Spanish crown. His fleet of 4 battered ships had been battered by storms and was limping along the Central American coastline, searching for a passage to the Pacific. The Genoese sailor ordered his men to intercept the canoe. His son Ferdinand Columbus, who was 14 years old at the time and serving as a crewman on the voyage, wrote a detailed account of what happened next. The Spanish sailors boarded the Maya vessel and began cataloging its cargo. Ferdinand noticed something peculiar. The Maya traders handled a pile of small brown beans with extraordinary care. He wrote that if a single bean spilled onto the deck, every native on the canoe would immediately scramble to retrieve it. No other cargo received that level of attention. Ferdinand did not know what the beans were. He described them in his journal as almonds of some kind, used as coin and for making a drink. Columbus himself showed almost no interest. The admiral was still searching for gold, for spices, for anything that would salvage his reputation with the crown. A canoe full of textiles and strange bitter seeds did not register as treasure. Columbus ordered a portion of the cargo seized, including some of the cacao beans. He sailed on, leaving the Maya traders to continue their journey. The beans sat in the hold of his ship, misunderstood and undervalued. No one in Europe had any idea what they were worth. Columbus died 4 years later in Valladolid, Spain, still believing he had found a route to Asia. The cacao beans he brought back passed into obscurity. The first European to grasp their true significance arrived 17 years later. Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Veracruz in April 1519 with 11 ships, 16 horses, and roughly 500 soldiers. He was a Spanish conquistador of modest birth, educated for the law at the University of Salamanca, but drawn to the Americas by the promise of land and gold. Within months, he had marched his army inland toward the Aztec capital. When Cortés entered Tenochtitlan in November 1519, he saw something no European had ever witnessed. The city was larger than any in Spain. Its canals and causeways and floating gardens supported a population of perhaps 200,000, far denser than Seville or Madrid. And inside the imperial palace, cacao beans were everywhere. Cortés observed that Aztec nobles used the beans to purchase goods in the markets. He noted that soldiers carried them on campaign as portable rations. He watched Moctezuma's servants prepare a frothy, bitter drink served to the emperor in golden vessels. Cortés was not a man of idle curiosity. He saw immediately that cacao was not merely food. It was a financial instrument, a store of value, a mechanism of control. In his letters to King Charles V of Spain, Cortés described the bean explicitly as currency. He wrote that a single load of cacao beans constituted a recognizable unit of wealth across the entire Aztec sphere of influence. He grasped something Columbus had entirely missed. If you controlled the flow of cacao, you controlled the economy that ran on it. Cortés and his army conquered Tenochtitlan in August 1521 after a brutal 93-day siege. The city was razed. Moctezuma was dead, killed under disputed circumstances. The Aztec Empire crumbled, but cacao did not. In 1528, Cortés returned to Spain for the first time since his conquest. He sailed across the Atlantic with a cargo far more valuable to his future negotiating position than gold. He brought cacao beans. He brought the stone metates and manos for grinding them. He brought the knowledge of how to prepare the bitter drink, extracted from Aztec palace servants and noble informants. Charles V received Cortés at the Spanish court in Toledo. The conquistador demonstrated the drink before the king and his council. The Spanish aristocracy was not impressed by the taste. The unsweetened liquid was bitter, cold, and slightly gritty. But the political and economic implications were immediately obvious. Cacao was the currency that had lubricated the wealthiest empire ever found in the Americas. The Spanish crown began laying plans for cacao cultivation in its new colonies. The next major transmission occurred in 1544. A delegation of Maya nobles from Guatemala traveled across the Atlantic to the court of Prince Philip, the future Philip II of Spain. The Maya had been conquered by the Spanish 2 decades earlier, but local elites retained significant influence as intermediaries between the colonial administration and indigenous populations. The delegation brought gifts intended to demonstrate their people's sophistication and value to the crown. Among those gifts was cacao. The Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, who spent decades advocating for the rights of indigenous peoples in the Spanish colonies, documented the visit. He watched the Maya nobles present cacao beans and drinking vessels to Prince Philip. Las Casas had been living in the Americas since 1502. He understood what the beans represented. His account described cacao as a food of immense cultural and economic importance, the very currency of native civilization. The Maya delegation made an impression. Philip II, who ascended the throne in 1556, would later oversee the expansion of Spanish cacao plantations across Venezuela and the Caribbean. But the commercial engine truly ignited in 1585. That year, a ship departed the port of Veracruz on the Gulf Coast of Mexico bound for Seville. Its hold carried the first documented commercial shipment of cacao beans, designated for European consumption. The cargo manifest listed over 200 loads of cacao, each load weighing roughly 50 pounds. The shipment represented a deliberate shift. Cacao was no longer a diplomatic curiosity or a tribute item for the crown's storehouses. It was a commodity, a product bought and sold at market. Merchants in Seville began distributing the beans to Spanish aristocrats, to convents, to wealthy merchant families in Castile and Aragon. The Spanish had also made a critical modification during the decades since Cortés first tasted the drink in Tenochtitlan. They added cane sugar. Sugar arrived on the same ships that carried enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. Spanish plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil produced sugarcane using captive labor. The bitter Aztec drink, once consumed cold and laced with chili and annatto, was transformed in Spanish kitchens. Cooks added cane sugar until the bitterness receded. They mixed in cinnamon imported from Ceylon via Portuguese trade routes. They stirred in vanilla, the same wild orchid the Maya had used for centuries, now grown under Spanish supervision in Veracruz. They heated the mixture until it was a warm, sweet, fragrant liquid served in small porcelain cups. The result was unrecognizable to anyone who had drunk chocolatl in Moctezuma's court. The emperor's sacred, mildly intoxicating, deeply bitter ritual beverage had become a confection. A luxury, an addiction for the Spanish elite. The secret was guarded tightly. For nearly a century, Spain controlled the European cacao supply almost exclusively. Spanish monasteries perfected the recipes and passed them between convents. Spanish aristocrats drank chocolate behind closed doors, while the rest of Europe remained largely ignorant of its existence. A warm, sweet, dark beverage brewed from beans that had once been money was about to escape its Spanish cage. When it did, it would reshape the appetites of an entire continent. In 1570, King Philip II dispatched his personal physician on a scientific mission to New Spain. His name was Francisco Hernandez. He spent 7 years traveling through Mexico, cataloging thousands of plants unknown to Europe. Among them was the cacao tree. Hernandez examined the tree in meticulous detail. He described its slender trunk, its broad dark leaves, its strange pods growing directly from the bark. He documented the 4 varieties of cacao recognized by Aztec growers. He recorded their names and their distinct medicinal properties as understood by indigenous healers. His notes described the preparation of the drink step by step. The beans were roasted, ground on a stone metate, mixed with cold water, and beaten to a froth. He classified cacao as a substance that was cold and humid in the humoral medical system of the time. Hernandez cataloged its effects with clinical precision. It reduced agitation, he wrote. It moderated the heat of the body. It was mildly stimulating but could cause insomnia if consumed to excess. He noted that the Aztecs used it to treat dysentery, to calm stomach pains, and to counteract the toxins from certain snake bites. His manuscript, completed in 1577, ran to 24 books and contained descriptions of over 3,000 plants. It was the most comprehensive natural history of the Americas ever assembled, but it remained unpublished during his lifetime. The manuscript sat in the library of the Escorial Palace near Madrid for nearly a century. A heavily abridged version was finally printed in 1651 under the title Rerum Medicarum Novae Hispaniae Thesaurus. It gave European physicians their first rigorous framework for understanding cacao as medicine, not merely as a luxury drink. Meanwhile, chocolate was still a Spanish secret. But secrets do not stay buried forever. In 1606, an Italian traveler named Girolamo Benzoni published his account of the Americas. The book was called Historia del Mundo Nuevo. Benzoni had spent 14 years traveling through Spanish territories in the Caribbean and Central America. He had seen cacao plantations firsthand. He had watched enslaved laborers harvest pods under brutal tropical sun. He had tasted the drink himself, and he hated it. Benzoni wrote that chocolate was more suitable for pigs than for human beings. The phrase was blunt, crude, and devastatingly quotable. He described the drink as a dark, greasy, bitter concoction that stained the lips and coated the tongue with an unpleasant film. His book sold widely across Italy, France, the German states, and England. It was translated into multiple languages. For many European readers, Benzoni's description was their first introduction to chocolate. His single dismissive sentence shaped public perception for decades. The drink that Spanish aristocrats consumed in private ecstasy was publicly mocked as swill across much of Europe. This slowed adoption outside Spain significantly, but not permanently. In 1615, the Spanish court orchestrated a marriage that would change the trajectory of chocolate forever. Anne of Austria, the 14-year-old daughter of King Philip III of Spain, was married by proxy to King Louis XIII of France. The wedding was a political alliance designed to cement peace between the two rival powers. Anne traveled to the French border town of Hendaye, where she was formally handed over to her new kingdom in an elaborate river ceremony. She brought with her a dowry, a retinue of Spanish ladies-in-waiting, and a private supply of cacao beans. Anne had grown up drinking chocolate at the Spanish court. It was her personal comfort, a warm, sweet reminder of home in a foreign palace. She had her servants prepare it for her in private chambers at the Louvre. The French court watched with curiosity. Anne's maid, a Spanish woman named Molina, was rumored to be the only person who could prepare the drink correctly. French courtiers whispered about the strange, dark beverage the queen consumed behind closed doors. Chocolate became associated with Anne, with Spanish refinement, with the mystery of a foreign queen. Within a few years, it was fashionable at the French court. The court apothecary formally approved it as a medicinal tonic. By the 1640s, chocolate was being prescribed by Parisian physicians for everything from consumption to melancholy. The French aristocracy had adopted it fully. Across the English Channel, a different kind of transmission was taking place. In 1657, an advertisement appeared in the Public Advertiser, a London news sheet. It announced the opening of a new establishment on Bishopsgate Street. The proprietor was a Frenchman whose name has been lost to history. The advertisement described, quote, an excellent West India drink called chocolate. Customers could buy it ready to drink at the shop. They could also purchase dried cakes of prepared cacao paste for home consumption, with instructions for preparation. The location was strategic. Bishopsgate Street was a major thoroughfare in the City of London, frequented by merchants, financiers, and government officials. The shop became a gathering place. Men of business and politics would sit at small tables, drinking cups of hot, sweet chocolate, discussing trade contracts and parliamentary maneuvers. Soon, other chocolate houses opened across London. They competed with the city's coffee houses, which had appeared a few years earlier. But chocolate houses cultivated a different atmosphere. They were slightly more expensive, slightly more exclusive, slightly more associated with Tory politics and aristocratic interests. Samuel Pepys, the great diarist of Restoration London, recorded his visits to chocolate houses in his journal entries of the 1660s. He went there to discuss naval business, to soothe a hangover, to escape the cold London winter with a warming cup. The drink he consumed was thick, sweet, and heavily spiced. It bore little resemblance to the bitter chocolatl of Moctezuma's court, but it carried the same cultural weight. It marked the drinker as a person of means, of taste, of connection. Yet a theological problem had been brewing for decades. The Catholic Church had never formally ruled on whether chocolate broke the ecclesiastical fast. The question was urgent and practical. Catholic Europe observed more than 150 fasting days per year. During fasting periods, consuming solid food was forbidden between meals. Only liquids were permitted. If chocolate was a drink, it was permissible. If it was a food in liquid form, it was a sin. The debate split theologians. Some argued that chocolate was so thick, so nourishing, so filling that it clearly constituted food. Others pointed out that it was prepared with water and could not possibly count as a meal. The matter reached the highest level of the Church. In 1662, Pope Alexander VII issued a definitive ruling. He declared that drinking chocolate did not break the ecclesiastical fast. The reasoning was straightforward. It was a liquid. It was consumed for refreshment, not for sustenance. Therefore, it was permissible even on strict fasting days. The ruling removed the last moral barrier to chocolate consumption among devout Catholics. Convents and monasteries, which had already been experimenting with chocolate recipes for decades, now embraced it openly. Spanish nuns had been perfecting methods of preparing chocolate for generations. Their recipes were kept in manuscript books, passed from convent to convent. They added cinnamon and vanilla and sugar. They experimented with different proportions of cocoa to water. They developed techniques for achieving the perfect froth. The clergy drank chocolate between prayers. Bishops served it to visiting dignitaries. Cardinals kept private supplies in their apartments at the Vatican. What had been an Aztec sacred beverage was now a sanctioned indulgence of the Catholic Church. The diffusion was no longer containable. From Spain to France. From France to England. From England back to the Italian states and the Low Countries. Chocolate was no longer a Spanish secret. It was a European obsession. The hunger for chocolate across Europe was no longer a curiosity. It was a permanent, structural demand. And that demand required a permanent, structural supply. The Spanish crown had already begun solving this problem decades earlier. In the early 1600s, Spanish colonists established the first large-scale cacao haciendas along the coastal valleys of Venezuela. The Cacao Valley, a narrow strip of fertile soil between steep mountain ridges and the Caribbean Sea, proved ideal. Its microclimate produced cacao beans of exceptional quality. But the trees did not plant themselves. The Spanish turned to the same labor system that was already remaking the entire Caribbean basin. Enslaved Africans, seized from their homelands and shipped across the Atlantic in the holds of Portuguese and Dutch vessels, were put to work in the cacao groves. They cleared the undergrowth with machetes. They planted saplings in the shade of taller mother trees. They harvested the ripe pods by hand, cutting them from the trunks with curved blades, pod by pod, row by row, under a tropical sun that did not forgive. They fermented the beans, dried them on wooden trays, and packed them into sacks for the mule trains that carried the harvest to the coast. The Cacao Hacienda became legendary for the quality of its cacao. But the legend was written in stolen labor. The Spanish were not alone for long. In 1634, the Dutch West India Company seized the island of Curaçao from the Spanish. Curaçao was not primarily a plantation island. Its deep natural harbor and strategic position made it something more valuable. It became one of the busiest slave trading depots in the Caribbean. Dutch ships brought captives from the Gold Coast, from the Bight of Benin, from Angola. From Curaçao, they sold those captives to plantation owners across the Spanish Main, including the cacao haciendas of Venezuela. The Dutch also planted cacao on their own Caribbean holdings, using the same enslaved workforce to feed the same European demand. The French followed the same logic. By the 1660s, French planters had established cacao operations on Martinique. Then they expanded to Saint-Domingue, the western third of the island of Hispaniola. Saint-Domingue would eventually become the most lucrative slave colony in human history. Cacao was not its primary crop, sugar was. But the two commodities shared the same economic architecture. Enslaved labor, tropical soil, European capital, European consumption. The system grew because the demand grew. By 1700, the British Royal Navy was issuing a daily ration of cocoa to sailors stationed in the West Indies. Ship logs record the practice as routine. A warm, sweet, high-energy drink that kept men alert on long watches. The Navy was not concerned with where the cocoa came from or whose hands had harvested it. The concern was caloric efficiency. The concern was empire. Meanwhile, back in Venezuela, the scale of production was accelerating at a rate no one would have predicted a century earlier. In 1700, the colony exported approximately 57 metric tons of cacao annually. By 1810, that number had risen to over 4,000 metric tons. The increase was not driven by technological innovation. The tools and techniques had barely changed since the Spanish first arrived. The increase was driven by human suffering. More land cleared. More trees planted. More captives brought across the ocean in chains, packed so tightly into the holds of slave ships that they could not stand, could not turn, could not breathe. The entire workforce, every hand that touched a Venezuelan cacao pod, from sapling to sack, was enslaved. The children born on those plantations inherited their parents' status. They inherited the machete, the carrying pole, the fermenting tray. They did not inherit freedom. And then, across the Atlantic, a new horror was taking shape. The Portuguese colonies of São Tomé and Príncipe, two small volcanic islands in the Gulf of Guinea, had been largely abandoned by the early 19th century. Sugar production had collapsed. The plantations had reverted to jungle. But the soil was volcanic and rich. The climate was humid and equatorial. Someone realized the islands could grow cacao. By the 1850s, Portuguese planters were reoccupying the old estates and planting cacao trees in the ruins of the sugar mills. They needed labor. Portugal had formally abolished slavery in its colonies in 1869, but the abolition had a loophole. A system of contract labor replaced the slave trade. Workers were recruited, the document said voluntarily, from the Portuguese colony of Angola on the African mainland. They signed 5-year contracts promising wages, housing, and return passage after their term expired. The word contract was a legal fiction. The workers were marched to the coast in shackles. They were loaded onto ships under armed guard. They arrived on São Tomé to find conditions that were, in every material sense, slavery. They were housed in locked compounds. They were paid in tokens redeemable only at company stores at company prices. They were beaten for failing to meet daily quotas that were often physically impossible. Death rates on the plantations were catastrophic. Workers died from malnutrition, from exhaustion, from tropical diseases that swept through the overcrowded compounds. When the 5-year contract ended, few were ever returned to Angola. The contracts were forcibly renewed. The debts for food and housing were calculated to ensure no worker could ever settle them. The system was so profitable that São Tomé and Príncipe became the largest cacao exporters in the world for a time. The chocolate of Europe, the hot, sweet drink in the London chocolate house, the bar of milk chocolate in a child's hand, was being fed by a pipeline of human misery that stretched from the Bight of Benin to the plantations of the Gulf of Guinea. And the consumers did not know. The chocolate house proprietors did not know. Or they did not ask. The architecture of production was deliberately invisible. The plantation was in one hemisphere. The consumption was in another. The suffering was abstracted into a number, a price per ton, a quarterly earnings report, and then it disappeared entirely into a warm, sweet brown drink that made people feel happy. This was the world chocolate built. In 1828, a Dutch chemist named Conrad Johannes van Houten patented a machine that changed chocolate forever. He called it a hydraulic press. The device used enormous pressure to squeeze roasted cacao paste between two metal plates. Most of the natural fat, the cocoa butter, drained away as a pale yellow liquid. What remained was a dry, brittle cake that could be ground into a fine powder. Van Houten took the invention one step further. He treated the cocoa powder with alkaline salts, potassium carbonate. The salts reacted with the bitter acids in the cacao. The powder became darker, mellower, and dissolved far more easily in water or milk. He called this process Dutching. It is still called Dutching today. The breakthrough was immense. For 3,000 years, cacao had been a dense, fatty paste that was difficult to work with. Van Houten split it into two separate ingredients, cocoa butter and cocoa powder. Each could now be used independently. The powder made chocolate drinks cheaper and smoother than ever before. The cocoa butter waited for someone to realize what it could do. That someone arrived in 1847 in the port city of Bristol, England. A company called J.S. Fry & Sons had been making chocolate since the mid-1700s. The firm's chemists began experimenting with Van Houten's separated ingredients. They took cocoa powder, added sugar, and then reintroduced melted cocoa butter into the mixture. The result was a thick, moldable paste that could be poured into small tin molds. When it cooled and hardened, it became something entirely new. It was solid. It was glossy. It broke with a clean snap. It melted on the tongue. Fry called it eating chocolate. It was the first modern chocolate bar the world had ever seen. For 3 millennia, chocolate had been exclusively a drink. In a single afternoon in a Bristol factory, it became a food you could hold in your hand. A food you could wrap in paper and ship to a shop. A food you could eat anywhere you wanted. The relationship between humans and chocolate shifted permanently in that moment. But Fry's bar had a limitation. It was strong, dark, and slightly bitter. The next transformation came from the mountains of Switzerland. In the late 1860s, a candle maker named Daniel Peter lived in the town of Vevey on the shores of Lake Geneva. Peter fell in love with a young woman whose family ran a chocolate shop. He married her and abandoned candles for chocolate. He became obsessed with one idea. He wanted to mix milk with chocolate to create a creamier, sweeter bar. The problem was that milk contains water. Water causes chocolate to seize up into a grainy, unworkable sludge. Peter tried for 8 years to solve this. He failed again and again. Then he turned to his neighbor across the street. His neighbor was a man named Henri Nestlé. Nestlé had recently invented a process for making powdered condensed milk. He heated fresh milk under vacuum until almost all the water evaporated. The result was a dry, shelf-stable powder that could be reconstituted with water. Peter realized this powder was the answer. Nestlé's condensed milk contained almost no moisture. It could be mixed directly into melted chocolate without causing the mixture to seize. Peter ground the milk powder fine as flour and blended it into chocolate paste. The bars that came out of his molds were pale brown, creamy, and sweet in a way dark chocolate had never been. In 1875, he launched his creation. He called it Gala Peter. It was the first successful milk chocolate bar in history. The partnership between the candle maker and the condensed milk salesman reshaped the global food industry. Henri Nestlé's name would eventually become one of the largest food corporations on Earth. Daniel Peter's milk chocolate would become the standard that defines what most of the world thinks of when it hears the word chocolate. But even Peter's milk chocolate had a roughness to it. The texture was slightly gritty, a little sandy on the tongue. The next breakthrough happened in 1879 in the city of Bern. A Swiss chocolatier named Rodolphe Lindt ran a small factory producing chocolate, using the standard methods of the day. He used granite rollers to grind cacao paste with sugar. The process left particles in the mixture that were still large enough for the tongue to detect. One evening, Lindt left his mixing machine running. He went home and forgot about it. The machine was a long stone trough with granite rollers that moved back and forth over the chocolate paste. It ran all night. When Lindt returned the next morning, he found something extraordinary. The chocolate in the trough was not the gritty paste he had left behind. It was glossy, fluid, and almost impossibly smooth. The extended mixing had ground the particles down below the threshold of human perception. The friction had generated heat that drove off harsh, volatile acids. The cocoa butter had been distributed evenly throughout the mass. The chocolate poured like velvet and melted on the tongue without a trace of grain. Lindt called his machine a conch, after the shell-shaped design of the trough. The process became known as conching. It remains the defining step in premium chocolate manufacturing to this day. Every smooth chocolate bar you have ever eaten owes its texture to a machine someone forgot to turn off in 1879. The Swiss had perfected chocolate, but an American figured out how to put it in the hands of ordinary people. In 1893, a caramel maker from rural Pennsylvania named Milton Snavely Hershey visited the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. He walked through the exhibits and stopped in front of a display of German chocolate-making machinery. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned to his cousin and said something that would change his life. He was going to sell his caramel business and go all in on chocolate. He did exactly that. He sold the Lancaster Caramel Company for $1 million, a staggering sum at the time. In 1894, he founded the Hershey Chocolate Company. He built a factory in the farm country of Dairy Township, Pennsylvania, surrounded by dairy farms that could supply fresh milk by the wagon load. Hershey's genius was not in making the finest chocolate. The Swiss and the Belgians had him beaten on that front. His genius was in making chocolate cheap enough that every single American could afford it. He built an entire town around his factory. He named it Hershey, Pennsylvania. The streets were called Chocolate Avenue and Cocoa Avenue. The streetlights were shaped like Hershey kisses. He built houses for his workers, a school for their children, a park, a trolley system, and a public library. His factory churned out millions of chocolate bars using assembly line methods borrowed from the meatpacking industry. The Hershey bar, wrapped in brown and silver foil, became the first chocolate most American children ever tasted. By the turn of the century, chocolate was reaching every corner of the industrial world. In 1905, the British Quaker firm Cadbury launched a new product from its factory in Bourneville, a model village outside Birmingham. They called it the Dairy Milk Bar. It contained a higher proportion of milk than any other chocolate on the British market. The recipe was developed by adding full cream milk condensed in copper vacuum pans. The result was a bar that tasted noticeably creamier and richer than its competitors. Within a decade, Dairy Milk became the best-selling chocolate bar in Britain. The factory at Bourneville expanded. The demand for cacao expanded with it. Somewhere far from the brightly lit shops of London and Philadelphia, in the equatorial heat of West Africa, new plantations were being carved out of the forest. The chocolate bar had arrived, and the world it would feed was about to get very, very hungry.
The roots of Cadbury stretched back to a small shop on Bull Street in Birmingham, England, in 1824. A young Quaker named John Cadbury opened the store selling tea, coffee, and drinking chocolate. The Cadbury family were devout members of the Society of Friends. Quaker theology emphasized the inner light of every human being and a strict commitment to social reform. John Cadbury believed business could be a force for moral good. He refused to sell products adulterated with chalk, brick dust, or animal fat, common practices among his competitors. He priced his drinking chocolate fairly and provided clean working conditions for his employees. By the 1840s, his shop had evolved into a small factory producing cocoa powder and chocolate bars. His sons Richard and George took over the business in 1861. The brothers inherited their father's belief that profit and principle could coexist. In 1879, they moved the entire operation out of Birmingham's polluted slums to a green expanse of countryside south of the city. They named the new site Bourneville. They built houses with gardens for their workers, provided schools, sports fields, and a library. They paid wages above the industry average and established a pension fund. The Cadbury brothers positioned their company as the ethical alternative in a deeply exploitative industry. They publicly condemned the labor practices that supplied their competitors. But there was a problem they did not yet fully understand. The cacao beans arriving at their factory came from places they had never seen. By the turn of the 20th century, Cadbury's primary source of high-quality cacao was the Portuguese colony of São Tomé and Príncipe. These two small volcanic islands sat in the Gulf of Guinea off the coast of West Africa. The equatorial heat and rich volcanic soil produced cacao of exceptional quality. By 1900, São Tomé was the largest cacao exporter on Earth. The island supplied roughly 20% of the world's cacao, and almost all of it was produced with enslaved labor. Portugal had officially abolished slavery in its colonies in 1869. In practice, the colonial government replaced it with a system called contract labor. Workers were recruited from the Portuguese colony of Angola on 5-year contracts. They were transported across the ocean in overcrowded ships. They were marched to the plantations and told they would work to pay off their passage and food. But the debts never cleared. The workers were paid nothing. They were kept in locked compounds surrounded by barbed wire. Wages were withheld, contracts were extended indefinitely, and discipline was enforced with the whip. Mortality rates on some plantations reached 20% per year. No worker ever returned home. In 1901, an English journalist named Henry Nevinson traveled to São Tomé to investigate. Nevinson was a veteran war correspondent and a committed abolitionist. He posed as a land speculator to gain access to the plantations. What he found horrified him. He witnessed workers beaten until they could not stand. He saw children separated from their parents and sold to different estates. He documented the sealed compounds, the starvation rations, and the systematic denial of wages. Nevinson published his findings in a series of articles for Harper's Monthly magazine. His book, A Modern Slavery, appeared in 1906. The evidence was undeniable, and the scandal was immediate. Cadbury was among the firms that sourced their cacao from São Tomé. The company that had built Bourneville and preached ethical business now faced an impossible contradiction. The chocolate bars it sold as wholesome family treats were made from beans picked by slaves. George Cadbury refused to believe the reports at first. The Portuguese government denied the allegations, and the plantation owners threatened legal action. But Cadbury could not look away. In 1904, the company dispatched its own investigator, a young Quaker named Joseph Burt, to São Tomé. Burt spent 2 years traveling across the islands, interviewing workers, and examining plantation records. His report confirmed everything Nevinson had written. The conditions were worse than he had imagined. Some workers were as young as 10 years old. Pregnant women were beaten for failing to meet their daily quotas. The death rate among contract laborers was catastrophic. The report forced Cadbury's board into a crisis. Publishing the findings would shatter their relationship with the Portuguese government and the São Tomé planters. Suppressing it would betray every principle the Cadbury family had ever claimed to hold. The company hesitated. For 3 years, Cadbury attempted to negotiate privately with the Portuguese authorities. They demanded reforms, improved wages, and the right for workers to return home. The Portuguese promised changes but delivered none. Meanwhile, the British press began to turn on Cadbury. The Evening Standard accused the firm of hypocrisy. The company that preached Quaker virtue was profiting from slave labor while delaying action. In 1908,
a Portuguese planter sued Cadbury for libel after company representatives described the labor conditions as slavery. The trial forced Cadbury to defend its reputation in open court. The proceedings exposed the full horror of the São Tomé system. Witness testimony described children chained by the ankles, workers starved until they collapsed, and mass graves for those who died on the job. The jury found in favor of the Portuguese planter, but awarded damages of a single farthing. The verdict was a legal loss and a moral victory. The evidence presented in court made it impossible for anyone to deny what was happening on the islands. In 1909, Cadbury and the other major British chocolate firms announced a complete boycott of cacao from São Tomé and Príncipe. The company redirected its supply chain to the Gold Coast, the British colony that would later become Ghana. The shift was massive and permanent. The boycott collapsed the São Tomé cacao industry within a decade. The Gold Coast rapidly became the dominant source of West African cacao. The Cadbury family had faced the truth and acted, but the stain never fully washed away. The company's investigators had documented abuse in 1904. The boycott did not begin until 1909. 5 years passed while Cadbury negotiated, and the workers remained in chains. The question of what a chocolate bar truly cost had been asked in a courtroom, and never fully answered. The boycott of São Tomé did not end the exploitation. It simply moved it to another continent. The Gold Coast won its independence from Britain in 1957 and renamed itself Ghana. Its neighbor, the French colony of Côte d'Ivoire, followed in 1960. Both nations inherited economies built almost entirely on agricultural exports. Cacao was the centerpiece. By the mid-20th century, West Africa had become the undisputed heart of the global chocolate supply chain. Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire planted more cacao trees than anywhere else on Earth. The equatorial climate and the deep, loamy soils of the region produced enormous harvests. Smallholder farmers cleared forests and carved out thousands of small plots. By the 2022 to 2023 growing season, Côte d'Ivoire alone produced roughly 2.2 million metric tons of cacao. Ghana produced another 750,000 tons. Together, these two countries supplied over 60% of all the cacao consumed on the planet. The entire modern chocolate industry depended on a narrow strip of West African coastline. And the entire West African cacao economy depended on smallholder farmers working tiny plots of land. Many of these farmers earned less than $1.25 per day. They could not afford to hire adult laborers to help with the harvest. So they used their own children. And they used the children of relatives sent from poorer villages. And in some cases, they bought children from traffickers who crossed the borders from Mali and Burkina Faso. The work was hazardous, and the children were young. Some were as young as 5 or 6 years old. By their early teens, they were expected to handle machetes sharp enough to sever a cacao pod with a single swing. They hauled sacks of wet beans weighing more than they did through the mud to the drying racks. They applied pesticides and fungicides without gloves or masks or protective clothing of any kind. The chemicals burned their skin and left them dizzy and nauseous at the end of the day. Most of these children never attended school. The farms were too remote, and the need for their labor was too urgent. This was the open secret of the modern chocolate industry. In 2001, the United States Congress commissioned a formal investigation. Tulane University in New Orleans sent researchers to Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana to document what was happening on the ground. The Tulane report confirmed the worst suspicions. Over 2 million children were engaged in hazardous work on cacao farms across the two countries. The report detailed the machetes, the chemicals, the heavy loads, and the long hours. It described children working in conditions that violated international labor conventions and the laws of their own nations. The evidence was overwhelming, and the public reaction was immediate. Consumers in America and Europe recoiled at the thought that their chocolate bars were produced by children in slavery conditions. The major chocolate companies faced a crisis of public relations and, potentially, of regulation. In September 2001, representatives of the chocolate industry signed an agreement with Senator Tom Harkin of Iowa and Representative Elliot Engel of New York. The document was called the Harkin-Engel Protocol. It pledged to eliminate the worst forms of child labor from cacao production entirely. The original deadline was July 1, 2005. That deadline passed, and the problem remained. A new deadline was set for 2008. That deadline passed as well. The industry cited logistical challenges and the difficulty of monitoring millions of small farms spread across remote rural areas. A framework was established, A certification system was designed, and pilot programs were launched. But the children kept working. The 2010 deadline was missed. The deadline was extended again to 2020. By the time the 2020 target arrived, the industry acknowledged that the goals of the protocol had not been met. The root causes were not a mystery. The average cacao farmer in Côte d'Ivoire earned less than $1.25 per day. That income was not enough to feed a family, let alone to hire adult workers. There were few schools in the cacao-growing regions, and fewer still that were free. The global price of cacao fluctuated wildly, driven by commodity speculators in London and New York. A farmer could plant and tend a crop for years, only to see the market price collapse at harvest time. In that economic environment, child labor was not an aberration. It was the only way to make the math work. The chocolate companies had pledged to fix the problem, but they had not changed the price they paid for the beans. The companies that signed the Harkin-Engel Protocol did not change the economics of cacao farming. They created certification programs instead. Fairtrade International emerged as the most visible alternative to the conventional market. The organization guaranteed a minimum price for certified cacao. That price floor was set at $2,400 per metric ton in 2020. An additional $240 per ton was paid as a social premium for community development projects. The logic was straightforward. Higher prices would lift farmers out of poverty. And poverty was the root cause of child labor. By 2022, Fairtrade certified roughly 10% of the global cacao supply. The label appeared on chocolate bars in supermarkets across Europe and North America. The familiar blue and green logo promised ethical consumption. The reality on the ground was more complicated. The guaranteed minimum price was higher than the volatile world market price in some years. But it was not nearly high enough to lift a farming family above the poverty line. A 2018 study by the French Development Agency found that Fairtrade certification increased farmer income by roughly 3% on average. 3% was not enough to hire adult workers. 3% was not enough to send children to secondary school. 3% was not enough to change the fundamental math of a smallholder operation. The farmers who benefited most were those who already belonged to well-organized cooperatives with access to markets. The most vulnerable farmers, the ones with the smallest plots in the most remote areas, remained outside the system entirely. The Rainforest Alliance and UTZ offered their own certification programs. These programs focused on environmental sustainability and basic labor standards. Inspectors visited farms and checked for compliance with a checklist of criteria. The criteria covered pesticide use, water management, and prohibitions against the worst forms of child labor. But the inspections were infrequent and announced in advance. A farm might be certified one year and using unpaid child workers the next. The certification bodies lacked the resources and the authority to monitor millions of scattered smallholdings continuously. The labels multiplied on supermarket shelves, each one promising a different kind of ethical assurance. The number of children working on cacao farms did not decline. In 2021, the United States Supreme Court delivered its final word on the matter. The case was Nestlé USA versus Doe. The plaintiffs were 6 former child slaves from Mali. They had been trafficked across the border into Côte d'Ivoire as children. They had worked on cacao farms without pay for years, some since the age of 5. They brought suit against Nestlé USA and Cargill under the Alien Tort Statute, a 1789 law that allows foreign nationals to sue in American courts for violations of international law. The plaintiffs argued that the companies had aided and abetted child slavery by providing financial and technical assistance to the farms where they were held. The companies did not dispute the conditions on the farms. They disputed whether an American court had jurisdiction. The Supreme Court ruled 8-1 that the claims involved conduct that occurred almost entirely outside the United States. The majority opinion, written by Justice Clarence Thomas, held that the Alien Tort Statute did not apply extraterritorially. The abuses had happened on foreign soil. The corporate decisions that allegedly enabled those abuses had been made in corporate headquarters in Switzerland and Minnesota. Neither fell within the reach of American law. The single dissenting vote came from Justice Samuel Alito. The case was dismissed. The former child slaves received no remedy. The question of legal liability for forced labor in the supply chain remained unanswered. The global chocolate industry continued to grow regardless. In 2022, the retail market for chocolate was valued at $130 billion. That number was projected to rise steadily through the end of the decade. 5 corporations controlled the vast majority of that market. Mars Incorporated, The privately held American giant behind M&M's and Snickers ranked first. Mondelez International, the spin-off that owned Cadbury, ranked second. Nestle, Ferrero, and the Hershey Company filled out the top 5. Together, these 5 companies processed most of the cacao beans grown on Earth.
Their supply chains converged on the same narrow strip of West African coastline, the same ports in Abidjan and Accra, the same warehouses and grinding facilities, the same smallholder plots where children carried machetes too heavy for their arms. The price of cacao on the world market remained the single factor that determined whether those children worked or went to school. And the world market price did not rise enough to change anything. Consumer awareness grew, driven by documentaries and news investigations, and the slow accumulation of evidence compiled by researchers at Tulane University and elsewhere. Surveys showed that a majority of consumers in wealthy countries claimed they would pay more for ethically sourced chocolate. But the market share of certified chocolate remained stubbornly limited. The cheapest bars on the shelf still sold the most units. The bean that the Maya believed was a gift from the gods had become a commodity traded by algorithms on screens in London and New York. Divine flavor rested on centuries of exploitation. The arrangement was not a secret, but it functioned like one. And then the climate began to shift. Cacao trees are exquisitely sensitive to temperature and humidity. They require a narrow band of conditions: consistent rainfall, high humidity, temperatures between 18 and 32 degrees Celsius, and deep shade. The narrow strip of West Africa that produced over 60% of the world's cacao sat precisely inside that band. Climate models projected that rising global temperatures would push those conditions out of the current growing regions within the next 3 decades. By 2050, large portions of the cacao belt in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana could become too hot and too dry to sustain production. The trees would stop producing pods. The farmers would lose their only source of income. The global supply of cacao would contract sharply. Prices would spike. The entire industry, the $130 billion, the 5 corporations, the millions of smallholders, the children in the fields, depended on a stable climate that was no longer stable. Researchers at the University of California and the International Center for Tropical Agriculture had been sounding the warning for years. The solutions proposed were genetic modification to create heat-resistant varieties, shifting cultivation to higher elevations, or moving production to new regions entirely. But cacao trees take years to mature. They cannot be relocated like a factory. They cannot be redesigned in a single growing season. The tree that the Olmecs first cultivated 3,500 years ago had evolved for a world that was now disappearing. And the millions of people whose survival depended on it had no alternative waiting. The crisis was not coming. The crisis had already begun, moving through the root systems and the rainfall patterns, invisible until the moment the pods stopped forming.